All right, full disclosure, this is one of my most favorite stories in all of Scripture. Weird, maybe, I know. But we need to rewind a little bit and fill in some of the backstory before we get to the divine wrestling match that informs so much of my own faith and that I hope is enlivening to yours as well. Jacob's narrative in Genesis starts at his birth, several chapters back. He's Abraham's grandson, Isaac's son, and if you remember anything about those two, you know that there's a lot of trauma in this family already. And Jacob is a twin. We got some twins in the house, so you know all about the twin trauma. He's just the barely younger one. I don't know who's younger, Ella or Gage. Ella's younger? All right, so she's the trickster. Got it. But Jacob came out of the womb with his hand gripping his brother Esau's heel, as if he was trying to pull Esau back in so he could climb out first. His parents named him Jacob, which means the usurper, or the surplanter, or more loosely, the cheat. And boy, does he live into that name. He's not strong like his brother Esau, so he schemes and cheats his way to success. First, he convinces his twin Esau to sell him his birthright for a pot of stew. So now he's got a double share of the inheritance. And later, with the help of his trickster mother, he convinces his elderly and mostly blind father that he is actually Esau, and he steals Esau's blessing. This is like some Old Testament stuff, but just note, Esau is feeling murderous now, and Jacob runs away. He runs away to the ancestral land that his granddad, Abraham, came from in the first place. And from here, the dramatic sibling rivalry takes a pause for about 20 years. But Jacob the trickster continues to live up to his name with his equally deceitful uncle Laban. The two match wits over and over again. Laban tricks Jacob into marrying the wrong daughter. Do you remember that story? Jacob tricks Laban about some goats or something. I don't know. It's complicated. You can read about it in Genesis 30-ish, but polygamy and biblical livestock are not my areas of expertise. Anyway, Jacob is still being Jacob. And in the end, we find him running away again. He gathers up his wives and his concubines and his children and his herds and his wealth and his servants, and he tries to sneak away. He's built up all of this over 20 years. Laban, his uncle, catches him, and there's a whole other episode here that includes stolen idols and wife number 2 faking her period and more deceit and more threats. I really can't get into it all right now as much as I would really like to. But if you want some Bachelor in Paradise level drama, just go read Genesis sometime. And yes, I did say period from the pulpit. This is what you get when you hire a woman as your pastor. Fewer sports analogies, more pointing out menstruation in the Bible. You're welcome. Anyway, now Jacob has nowhere to go but back home after 20 years away, to the brother whose birthright he swindled and whose blessing he stole, to the brother who is now a powerful and wealthy nomadic ruler, to Esau, the brother who, just before our reading today, finds out that Jacob is on his way back and sets out to meet him with an army. So things are not looking good for Jacob. And this is where we find him today, in the story that we read. He's sent his servants with flocks and wealth to meet Esau's army in hopes of bribing his way into their good graces. He's split up his family into 3 different parties and sent them ahead, hoping Esau will have mercy on the poor, defenseless women and children, right? Or at least there's a human barrier in between. And he sends everyone ahead of him, across a river even. We've even got a natural barrier. Jacob stays back completely alone with as much distance, as many barriers between himself and the problems he has created as he can possibly manage. What's he doing out there? We don't know, right? Maybe he's praying to God for help. Maybe he's plotting some last-minute scheme. We know he's good at the scheming. Maybe he's having a panic attack. Maybe he's taking a moment to reflect on his life before what seems like his inevitable death. We don't know, but we know that he is utterly and completely alone until he's not. Out of the darkness, someone or something pounces on him and throws Jacob to the ground. There's no clue about who this stranger is at first, just the vivid picture of Jacob and the stranger locked in an intense struggle, wrestling until daybreak. It's this moment that I am tempted to be smug and relish that Jacob is finally getting what he deserves, right? Unfortunately, it's also the moment that I start to identify with Jacob. W. Thomas, one of my favorite authors, writes, "How often have you found yourself alone in the dark in a desolate place? How often in that menacing darkness have you done solitary battle with something you won't recognize as God until much, much later?" She goes on, "All of the epic battles of our lives, our battles with guilt, shame, fear, doubt, grief, or unforgiveness, our wrestling matches with family, friends, enemies, community, church, or creed, are ultimately battles with and about God. It is with God and in relationship to God and in God's all-encompassing presence that we fight the fights that bend, break, and remake us. Whether we recognize the divine presence or not, it's our wrestling, it's our struggling, even our wounds, where we often find so much of our meaning and our identity, isn't it? You know this to be true. At my pastor's retreat last weekend, we did an exercise where we had to tell our life story in 4 minutes or less. And guess what? The notable moments, the moments that could fit into 4 minutes, the things that shaped us, were more often than not struggles, right? 5 pastors in a room. I heard about divorces, deaths of loved ones, recovering from addiction, managing depression, the pain of job loss, wrestling with our calling. And my guess is that things like these would pop up as important parts of your 4-minute life story, too. If we can recognize God in those struggles, in our wrestling, we find a God who is very different than the fragile and impotent, dusty relic that so much of our world imagines. We find a God who is wild, who is vulnerable, who is not afraid to get dirty, who engages with us intimately and unpredictably, who invites our wrestling and pushing and persistence and strength, a God who holds on to us when we are swinging at him. After fighting all night, the divine stranger realizes that Jacob is not going to give up. Finally, he dislocates Jacob's hip and demands that he let him go. And after all this, after he's clearly beat, Jacob has the audacity to say no. He may not be clear on exactly what is happening or who this divine stranger is, but he knows it's no ordinary human. He recognizes that something powerful, something divine is present in the stranger, and he refuses to let him go. "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And beloveds, this is one of the most true and beautiful images of faith that I know of. It's the spirituality of hanging on for dear life, the spirituality of persistence, the spirituality of petulant, childish demands of God, even and especially when we are at our most broken, our most tired, at our worst. "I will not let you go unless you bless me." This is my personal mantra when I approach the biblical text each week. I will not let you go unless you bless me. I'm not leaving these stories that have been used to do so much damage to women, to queer folks, to colonized and enslaved people. I will not let you go until I wrestle out some good news. That's my mantra each week. And the blessing always comes. Sometimes at daybreak on a Sunday morning, after a long night of wrestling, I will admit, but it never fails. I will not let you go unless you bless me. It's my mantra for preaching and for church life in general. I know there is a blessing in this mess somewhere, right? Even in the hardest, in the darkest, in the most uncertain times, when we are feeling isolated and vulnerable and living like Jacob in a mode of self-preservation and fear, God meets us, surprises us, maybe tosses us around a little. I don't know about you, but I'm not leaving without my blessing. I've done a whole lot of wrestling, taken a whole lot of bruises to be able to stand in this pulpit, and I know that most of you have done more than your fair share of wrestling to be here too. We, like Jacob, are a people who refuse to let go of God. Before the stranger gives Jacob his blessing, he asks him a question. What is your name? What's your identity? Who are you really? And it's not as if he doesn't know, right? But I think it prompts Jacob to have a flashback to the last time he was seeking a blessing and was asked the same question. It's 20 years prior, just 5 chapters earlier in Genesis. Jacob is younger and standing in his father Isaac's tent, wearing his brother's clothes, with animal skins on his arms, impersonating his twin. Isaac, his father, is old and blind and still feels like something isn't quite right here. He asks the man in his tent, "What is your name? Who are you?" And Jacob, the trickster, the cheat, the heel grabber, lowers his voice and lies with confidence. "I am Esau," he says. Now, 20 years later, Jacob has the chance to answer the question again and honestly, and to finally receive a blessing that actually belongs to him, just as he is, who he is. "What is your name?" God asks. "I am Jacob." And his whole story, all the manipulation and deceit, all the running away, is right there in the name. Before his blessing, he has to face the truth about himself. And after all of our wrestling, I wonder if God asks us the same question. Who are you? Who am I? Really? At your core, underneath all the striving and working and consuming, underneath the image you project to the world in order to get its blessing, can you confront your true self and bring it honestly before God without deceit or shame or pretending? Before our blessing, we have to face the truth about ourselves, because it's only from that truth, whatever it is, that we can begin to be transformed. So here's Jacob. His hip is dislocated. He's in excruciating pain, only one working leg. The vulnerability of his true identity is leaking out of him in this moment. He's holding on for dear life to this divine stranger, and finally he gets his blessing. And with it, a new name, an expanded identity. The man says, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." No longer a deceiver, he is now the fighter. No longer the trickster, he is now the persistent one. No longer the heel grabber, he's now the one who holds on. Notice that these are not really changes in Jacob's character. He's still irreverent. He's still conflictive. He's still an unconventional hero. When he gets honest about who he isn't punished by God for it. He's just reshaped, revisioned. He's not a different person altogether. He's just seen from a different angle. He can now live into the name that God gives him, the one who contends with God. Jacob, now Israel, eventually goes on to reconcile, sort of, with Esau, and his children and grandchildren become the namesakes for the 12 tribes of Israel. I love that the people of Israel carry this name as their main identifying mark throughout history until this very day. They are not the favored people or the perfect people or the submissive people. They are the God wrestlers. Isn't that great? And in our own way, we get to carry that name too through Jesus of Nazareth, who we follow and who we wrestle with. in whom we find surprisingly and mysteriously God in. This God meets us in our aloneness, in our vulnerability, in our struggle, and in our inner conflict. This God not only accepts, but encourages and engages us and blesses us in our wrestling. This God knows our name, our true identities, our fears and resentments, our dreams and our pretenses. And through Jesus, this God gives us a new name, Beloved. You are my beloved child. At the end of our story, Israel marks the spot of his holy wrestling by naming it Peniel, because he says, I have seen God face to face and survived. The sun rose on him as he went on, limping because of his hip. He marks the place of the divine encounter just as he himself is marked by it. Church, where are your sacred wrestling rings? How have you marked them? How do you remember them? The times that you've seen God face to face, how have they changed you, shifted your vision of your own identity? I wonder if the limps and the scars that we bear may just be part of the blessing. Reminders of God's face, of our new names, for when we enter new struggles, which we will, new seasons of vulnerability or loneliness or change. Beloveds, when you're in the ring, may you keep an eye out for the divine, even when you least expect it. May you embrace the spirituality of hanging on for dear life. And may you remember your true names, your true identity as children of God, beloved God wrestlers. Thanks be to God. Amen.